Ah, welcome back, my dearest friend and treasured guest. Come in, come in. It's far too cold to linger outside when I've got a fire roaring and hot mulled wine brewing. Well, yeah, I guess I am completely soaked to the fur. But it'd be cold outside anyway. Actually, I have a completely normal reason to be soaked to the fur. I was thinking about the sea again. Yes, the sea. The ocean. It's very... it's very... The sea. There's something to it. Its age, its wetness, its magnanimity. I was thinking about deities and, where one might find divine power in nature for worship. And obviously, one of the biggest forces in nature has got to be, the sea. So naturally, I completely submerged myself in a nearby pond for a few hours to meditate on this divine energy. Very normal stuff. Oh, I will most definitely be visiting a hospital shortly here. The pond was mostly frozen over. But while we wait for medical personnel to treat my definite hypothermia, how about I regale you with a ghost story by the fire? Very, very nearby the fire. I cannot stress enough the fact that I can't feel my paws right now. In fact, speaking of the sea, I have just the perfect ocean-adjacent story for your consumption this evening. Pairs nicely with the mulled wine. The famous haunted ocean liner, the RMS Queen Mary. No doubt you've heard of it. It's probably one of the most all-time famous ghost stories, period. It'll definitely be one of the longer stories, but I live out in the middle of nowhere, and it'll take a long time for the ambulance to come get me. Come, get close to the fire, and let me leech off of your body heat, please. What do you mean I smell like a wet dog? Oh, you know what? I don't have a sense of smell right now.
Welcome to the foxhole at Foxxo Esoterica. I promise I was sober when I wrote this.
Ahoy, sailors, and welcome back to Foxxo Esoterica, the paranormal podcast that's often 3 sheets to the wind. I'm your host, Captain Forseti Fox, here to steer your vessel clear of the doldrums of boredom. I've enlisted no first mates for this episode, so indeed, it will be a solo stint, but that's intentional, because tonight's story is going to cover a particularly involved and lengthy topic that drunken discourse may unnecessarily elongate. No 3-hour episodes here, mateys. I'm going for the blue riband of storytelling. But before I do that, housekeeping. And I didn't actually write down what I was going to say, but I think I have a pretty good idea as to what I want to say, so I'm going to ad-lib and hope that in the post it sounds good. But I have 2 pieces of housekeeping today. The first is that I released a single because sometimes I make music and I didn't want to give up on that. It's called Missing My Guitar by Forseti Fox, and you can find it on Spotify, you can find it on YouTube, you can find it on Apple Music, I think. I released the music on a different platform than podcast, so I don't actually remember what websites have my song, but if you're interested in hearing my music, in like the music you're hearing in the background, then similar vibe. I also started a TikTok account finally, and the TikTok account is mostly plugging the podcast because I'm telling ghost stories on it. However, it is the one and only time in my life that I have been unable to use the name Forseti Fox as a username because somebody else took it first, which is the first time that's ever happened. So keep an eye out for Forseti Fox if you're interested in TikTok. I think that'll actually cover the housekeeping. I timed that perfectly. Keeping the ad-libbing train going. Hope I can, do good at it. The first bit was a first take. Right now I'm on my third for this section. But tonight, the potion brewed I'm going to be drinking is another beer I got from the German kiosk down the street. And this one is the Hansa Pils. For those who don't know about German history, the Hansa Company is like one of those, I don't think it's medieval, but early Renaissance to maybe medieval times. Didn't look it up. But it's a German trade empire that uses a lot of ships. And since I'm going to be talking about a ship ghost story, it looked pretty in theme. And also my options were limited because it was a kiosk and I keep forgetting to go to the Bürotech, which is at the mall. They have they don't have a lot of craft beers in Germany, but they do have a store called the Bürotech, and it's got the beers from all over Germany. And one day I will actually take the effort to walk all the way there to do this podcast potion brewed bit in a way that doesn't involve kiosk beer. Though I haven't had this, and I'm excited about it, and I'm rambling for too long. So let's pop it. Oh, that's delicious. Oh, it's very savory. It's very rich. It's not the craziest maltiest thing of all time, but like it's hitting, and I like it. Yay, the Hansa Company. And yes, for those who are roller coaster enthusiasts, Hansa Park is named after that historical shipping empire. So, the more you know. Alrighty. And before I go back into Script Town, the encyclopedic collection we're going to be using this evening is Iromabu Phantasma, because of the ghosts, in addition to the Big Boys 8,000 book series, semicolon, the collection of highly popular paranormal stories that everybody that does a paranormal podcast covers eventually, but I feel compelled to do anyway because I like it a lot. Maybe I can add a little something to it. We'll see. Ad-lib section over. If I may wax poetic before jumping in. I may be a fungal bog witch at heart, but if I had to worship another mystical pagan domain, it would have to be the enigmatic, and oftentimes erotic, spirit of the sea itself. I've often stared longingly into the waves for hours, drinking in the feeling that I am so much smaller than this force, so much younger than this presence, so humbled to be held in the same court of such majesty. These waters have tasted landscapes utterly alien to me, in times lost to all history, and they've brought complete destruction to entire empires, and will soon bring destruction if we modern mortals continue to underestimate her wrath. There is a power, and a wisdom, and almost a sort of dominance that brings out the submissive in me, brings out the knowledge that I am a mere mortal on this plane of existence, and that's perfectly fine. I strive to do good, and it is indeed good to champion for people's rights and comforts, and to revere the forces of nature that could cause so much damage should I act callously, but I will never shake the world itself as much as the sea, this force of nature, this eternal being, and that is good. There should be no expectation to. I am nurtured by her, and I should easily have my candle snuffed out, should I ever deign to underestimate her, as it is for us all. And in that itself I am humbled, and honored to cover a legend that relates to the sea, to the spirit of the ocean, to water, to erosion, to voyage, to tides, to life. So anyway, this episode of Foxxo Esoterica will probably be one of the lengthier ones, in regards to solo episodes. It's not going to be 3 hours. I'm going to be covering a big boy, semicolon, a story that's already highly famous and often covered in paranormal circles. It's the most haunted mobile location by far. It's perhaps one of the most haunted ships in all of the ghost hunting community, sharing a fierce notoriety rival with the Mary Celeste or even the Flying Dutchman. Dear friends, tonight we're going to be discussing the RMS Queen Mary, a British ocean liner that turned into an Allied troopship during World War II, that once again had a stint as an ocean liner before finally retiring as a floating hotel in Long Beach, California. Which I guess isn't retiring, she's kind of still working. But her colorful history is perhaps barely outshined by her many alleged hauntings. In fact, some claim that the 80,000-ton behemoth of a sailing vessel is home to over 150 different ghosts. Among these ghosts include the spirit of a poor engine worker, crushed to death by the machinery, the ghost of an officer who accidentally drank an unhealthy amount of poisonous carbon tetrachloride, and perhaps even the spirits of 239 Allied soldiers that tragically perished when the Queen Mary accidentally collided with and sank an escort ship named the HMS Curacoa. Indeed, this vessel-turned-hotel is by far one of the most haunted locations of all time, and stories of spirits continue well into the contemporary times. Folks can still rent a room to this day. Well, maybe soon. COVID kind of threw a wrench into that. But yes, tonight, I'd like to truly get into the history of such a staple in the paranormal community and dedicate an episode to such a momentous story in history itself. And rest assured, skeptics, the history section of this episode is going to be very long. But first, the sources, a section that also boasts a considerable tonnage. To begin with, the Queen Mary's Hotel website has a lot of good information across the board, and I've been using that pretty regularly for each section. There's a book written by Brian Clune and Bob Davis titled Ghosts of the Queen Mary, I used the page titled Ghosts of the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, on the website Legends of America. I used Wikipedia again. I used the article SS Queen Mary and the Loss of the HMS Curacoa, 1942, on the Naval Historical Society of Australia's website. Don't know why Australia covered it, but the Queen Mary did eventually go there at some point. The article on the website Emma Cruises, titled How Many People Died Aboard the Queen Mary, Crew and Passenger List, written by Emma Latisse. If I switch up the format for my references, it keeps the section fresh and interesting, which is important because this ghost story is massive and involves a lot of reading. I used the article Is the RMS Queen Mary Haunted on the website Yesterday's America. I used the article Ghosts of the Queen Mary, Second Officer Stark, on the website The Dead History, written by Jennifer Jones. The Queen Mary case file on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries website. A video titled The Real Ghost Stories of the RMS Queen Mary, the real is capitalized, on the channel Part-Time Explorer. And I also used a link that I forgot to actually write the notes on, but it's from the Sci-Fi Channel, and it's titled, The Road Trip I Stayed in California's Most Haunted Hotel Room and Communed with Ghosts. And I do name drop the person later on. I guess I could open up the link now, but I'm already on Google Docs, and I don't want to, make the formatting weird and have to find my page again, so worry not. I will reference that later if I forget to do it in my notes. So, we have a vessel that was crafted during the 1930s. We should probably tackle that pesky history corner before we get into anything particularly ghosty. Though, as I mentioned, that's going to take a while. So I'll be splitting up the history a bit with something paranormal every once in a while for you filthy ghost enthusiasts. The RMS Queen Mary is, as mentioned, an example of an ocean liner, which in technical terms is any ship used to transport passengers across the ocean. Not a very complicated definition. This means that, technically, pre-industrial sailing ships counted as ocean liners, and the first few liners that focused on passengers, and specifically passenger comfort, at the expense of moving specific cargo, was the Black Ball Line's fleet of 4 packet ships. However, I'm not going to get into too much sailing ship lore and throw around words like brigantine and lateen sails, because the Queen Mary was definitely past that time period where I'd need to explain such things. The Black Ball Line is interesting, however, because they started offering their services only a year before the first steamship, the SS Savannah, would cross the Atlantic in 1819. Folks were not too eager to try such a trek, however, due to the fact that the transatlantic journey took 27 days, and that this sort of new technology wasn't really regarded as safe. It is important to note that some sailing ships could knock out that stretch in 21 days, as opposed to their steamship cousins. To make this business more lucrative, seafaring businesses needed to both make engines bigger and better without burning the ship down in the middle of the ocean in the process. Fans of the Titanic also know that sometimes the ocean has little obstacles that you can hit, and maybe sometimes cause a crash with. So safety measures would need to extend a bit past mere engine efficiency. However, efficiency was not something to scoff at. There was even an instance involving the SS Sirius, a steamship in 1837, that used too much coal too quickly on their trip and had to break down the wooden furniture to use as fuel, lest they find themselves stranded out in the middle of the ocean. So, technological improvements would be made over time. One of the most important technological discoveries came when the SS Great Western, which, funny enough, arrived in the US literally a day after the SS Sirius, despite leaving a few days afterwards, finished its trek. You see, the SS Great Western had a tonnage of 1,300 GRT, parentheses gross registered tons, the standard unit for ship weight, as opposed to the silly little Sirius's 700 gross registered tons. And with this little anecdote, shipwrights learned that heavier ships met with less resistance in the water, and were therefore more fuel efficient. However, shipwrights would continue to build their big boys out of wood, which made them quite fragile. As a result, these ocean liners started rolling out with ironclad hulls in 1845, with the SS Great Britain being the first, a ship that immediately ran aground and was left abandoned within a year. There would be 30 years of ships experiencing explosions and fires on deck and people just not being good at piloting them before there was a small semblance of safety. People were perhaps a little bit too focused on speed and fuel efficiency, saving money, than they were of public safety. I guess they didn't need to worry about it that much because it's not like people were just going to stop crossing the ocean and airplanes didn't exist yet. I'm not going to get too into the full rundown of every time an ocean liner did poorly, but it was during this period that an important ocean liner company rivalry would emerge. The rivalry between the White Star Line and the Cunard Line, before they made up and got merged in 1934. Which brings us full circle, because the Cunard Line were the big brains behind the RMS Queen Mary. The Cunard Line, named after Halifax shipping magnate Samuel Cunard, began its stint as a steamship sailing ocean liner business in 1839, though its first steamship, the RMS Britannia, would first start making journeys a year later. The Cunard Line was actually able to claim the Blue Riband, an accolade for fastest transatlantic voyage, until those slimy, greasy scoundrels over at the White Star Line took it in 1870. Competition worsened in 1902, when the White Star Line started rolling out what they'd refer to as superliners, which are, ocean liners but bigger, because they're super. This started with the RMS Oceanic, and was actually funded by J.P. Morgan, who straight up purchased the White Star Line that same year. The Cunard Line responded by building two different superliners of their own in 1906, the Mauretania and the Lusitania. Longtime fans of history will recognize that name. Those two ships would commandeer, pun intended, the Blue Riband in 1909, and the Lusitania would actually hold on to it up until it got torpedoed by Germany in World War I. Feel free to scratch off both the reference to Germany and the longtime fans of history squares off on your Foxxo Esoterica bingo cards. However, a new competitor would enter the scene, Norddeutsche Lloyd aus Deutschland. In 1929, the SS Bremen would once again steal the Blue Riband from the Cunard Line, who still claimed it via the Mauretania, and further pressure from the White Star Line, as well as another up-and-comer, the Italian Line, and also further on down the line, the French Line, prompted the bigwigs at Cunard to build something great, something to really make a splash in the ocean liner community. Pun intended. Enter the Queen Mary. A ship construction project first broke ground, or water so to speak, on the River Clyde in Clydebank, Scotland in 1930. This project would receive the ominous name of Hull Number 534. However, the 1930s had a reputation for being quite depressing, and the Great Depression put an economic strain that halted all Hull Number 534 related construction in 1931. The Cunard Line ended up applying to the British government for a loan, and even though a lot of money was being asked for, the government agreed, under one stipulation, that the Cunard Line merge with its fiercest competitor, the White Star Line. Funny enough, the White Star Line was also in the process of building a super mega ship, the Oceanic, which was also stalled by the fact that money wasn't in their pocket during the Great Depression. The goal of such a merger was to prompt a weekly route from New York to Liverpool, and the Cunard Line was actually asked to build a second ship to help with this. And in the spring of 1934, the merger was complete. The Cunard White Star Line became the newest big name in ocean liners. Also, I didn't write this in the notes, but I should mention that even though a Halifax man started the company, it quickly became a British company over time. The Hull Number 534 was completed in the fall of 1934 at a cost of £3.5 million sterling, almost $350 million US dollars in 2023 money, when adjusting for inflation. I'm not going to be doing that for any other forms of currency. I know I got a lot of fans in a lot of different countries, but I don't want to do a lot of math. The ship had a tonnage of 80,774 GRT, was 1,019 feet in regards to overall length, 310 meters. Doing that conversion seems important enough. And had a height of 181 feet, 55 meters. Luxurious accommodations were also added, keeping a sort of Art Deco architecture. And some accommodations would include libraries, swimming pools, tennis courts, and classrooms/lecture halls for all levels of education. The phone would also claim to have the ability to connect to any telephone all over the world. It is also during this year that the ship would receive its name, the RMS Queen Mary, named after the wife of then King Henry V, Mary of Teck. Rumor has it that the ship was originally going to be named after Queen Victoria, mostly because the Cunard Line really liked naming their ships names that ended in the letters IA for some reason. The White Star Line kind of did that with the letters IC, Oceanic, Titanic. I think they're just having a vibe. However, when the company asked King Henry to bless their ship, they told him that they were going to be naming it after the greatest queen in English history, to which the king responded with, "Oh great, my wife will be delighted," prompting an immediate name change. This is a rumor though, and has never been proven to be true, I should add. But there was another naming fiasco, which wasn't a rumor. There was a steamship on the River Clyde already named the Queen Mary, and when the Cunard White Star Line finished their ship, they kindly asked the vessel to change its name to the TS Queen Mary II, which they relented to at first, but then they eventually changed, even though they were there first. The ship, the Queen Mary, would make its way down to the southern English city of Southampton in preparation for the transatlantic maiden voyage in the May of 1936. This little journey down the Irish Sea proved a tad bit tricky, though, for a number of reasons. First, the River Clyde wasn't deep enough for the Queen Mary, so they had to dig it deeper somehow. It also ran aground at a point while on the river, and was painstakingly put back on the water with tugboats. This isn't to say that the trek down took 1.5 years. The RMS Mary was sitting on the River Clyde for a while. Getting a ship launched takes a lot of preparation when you build it on a river. I'm not a shipbuilding aficionado, but I would imagine this step of the process taking less time if one were to build an ocean liner on the ocean first. But nobody consulted me on that back then, so. On May 27th, 1936, the RMS Queen Mary began its first transatlantic journey. It was captained by Sir Edgar Britton, longtime Cunard Line vet. The aforementioned French line held the blue riband with the SS Normandy, which made its accolade-snatching voyage a year prior. But after the RMS Queen Mary landed in New York on June 1st of that year, the Cunard Line, plus the White Star Line at this point, once again commandeered the blue riband with an average speed of 30 knots, which, as a werewolf enthusiast, is an acceptable number. The RMS Queen Mary would hold the blue riband for 14 whole years, while making regular treks for the next 4. But, in the August of 1939, the RMS Queen Mary would be slated for a massive brand overhaul. The history section isn't quite over, and I am kind of like having a little bit of mystery going on, even though I explained what's going to be going on in the introduction of this video. But either way, may I offer you, supernaturally minded aficionados, a ghost story interlude before I jump back in? We offer a high-class ghost story, a 1936 vintage for your pleasure. See if you can't perceive the notes of ghosts, the scary tannins. This bit was brought to you by the fact that I don't have anyone checking my scripts before I get into bits to test them for quality, because Puma will make fun of me for all of them. Bits aside, let's get into talking about the ghost of somebody who passed away while on board. Where to start, though, is an important question. Because as I said in the intro, it is claimed that 150 ghosts haunt the floating premises, with a verifiable 49 deaths on deck. Seafaring was not remotely a safe means of traveling back then. The Titanic disaster is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to ocean mishaps. Do I have an audience still? Did you recover from that pun yet? Thank you for your faith in my storytelling, those who stayed around. It's not well placed. In 1949, the senior second officer, a 30-year-old man named W.E. Stark, drank some poison. He thought it was gin, and it was not. It was poison. Stark did have the wherewithal to visit the doctor, who advised that the senior second officer get his stomach pumped immediately, but Stark didn't think that it was altogether a big deal. So 3 days later, he died. It was carbon tetrachloride that was the thing that did him in, a chemical used to clean furniture. The man was no naval novice. The Englishman, William Eric Stark, his full name, started apprenticing as a sailor at the age of 17, and even received many accommodations during World War II. But a stellar naval career does not automatically equal poison wisdom. The captain at the time, Andrew McKellar, recalled in his testimony that the two retired to Stark's cabin for drinks, when the two mistook a dirty old bottle of carbon tetrachloride in the dark room as gin. Which, isn't a simple mistake, especially when you start drinking it and notice the taste. Gin isn't that bad. There are distinct juniper notes that you think you'd miss. McKellar, at least, did take the medical precautions needed to not die of a poisoning, so, if there's a takeaway from this story, it's that no amount of masculinity and manliness can protect you from poison. Unless your name is Mithridates the Great. People who aren't history buffs, I invite you to Google that one. Toxic masculinity, pun intended, can lead to fame on the other hand. And it is claimed that W.E. Stark's ghost is one of the most active on the Queen Mary to this day. However, Stark didn't actually end up dying while on board. Plot twist. The ship landed in Southampton, and he was able to be taken to the Royal South Hants Hospital before shuffling off his mortal coil. That still doesn't stop people from witnessing the spirit of a man matching the senior second officer's description, manifesting in the room that used to be his quarters. Not that I've been there myself, I can't really corroborate the ghost with the 2 pictures I saw of the man, but he's a smooth-faced white guy with a very high hairline, and that's the guy that people report seeing. The ghost doesn't simply stand there, though. No. It is often reported that he snoops around the room, like he's checking the cupboards for something. Parentheses, maybe the gin. And some even report hearing ethereal coughing and gasping noises while in the quarters, while no one else is in the room. Almost like someone's choking on something. Parentheses, maybe the poison. The spirit is also said to haunt the main deck as well as the engine room. A tour guide by the name of Tony Ashland reports seeing the ghost holding a clipboard and looking quite official down in the engine room. In the interest of avoiding spoilers, there is an infamous, very haunted room that I'll talk about down the line. Maybe it's stateroom B340, maybe it's not, but either way, no one ever associates Stark with this room, so I'm led to believe that he drank poison and haunts a different room, which again, is not the room he died in. Time marches on, though, and history is not just some high school drum major to be ignored. The RMS Queen Mary made its last pre-war voyage across the Atlantic while being escorted by the HMS Hood, but by the time the two vessels arrived in New York, World War II had officially begun. As a result, the Queen Mary, alongside the aforementioned Normandy, would be completely renovated and turned into military ships to help with the war effort. A camouflaging gray coat of paint would be applied, actually prompting the ship to receive the nickname, the Grey Ghost. It was also constructed with a degaussing coil, which cut off the magnetism that the ship gave off and prevented that vessel from triggering mines. Sorry to all my Juggalo fans, the mysteries of magnetism deepen. The Queen Mary would make its first transport to Sydney, Australia, in 1940, alongside the RMS Queen Elizabeth and the SS Normandy, but not that one for long because the ship accidentally caught on fire and was destroyed before they could ship it out. On May 5th, the Grey Ghost would enter in a convoy and make a journey to Scotland. The troopship would routinely go from the UK to Australia to Boston/New York and make upwards of 72 wartime voyages throughout her entire career as a naval ship. The RMS Queen Mary would not make these journeys without a number of complications, however, and perhaps the most disastrous was the sinking of the HMS Curacoa. On October 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary hit dead-on and functionally sliced through one of her escort ships, the HMS Curacoa, on accident, while out on the Irish Sea. This resulted in the deaths of 239 people. The accident was obviously horrifying, though because of wartime security, details about the situation didn't really come to light until after the war ended, nor did any court hearings. It is stated that the Queen Mary sailed in a zigzag maneuver, something that helped it avoid U-boats, but that on this particular day she just overshot, leading to a collision. The smaller ship just split in half and sank right there, and because the Curacoa was 20 times smaller than the Queen Mary, the larger vessel didn't meet with any resistance. There are contradictory reports circulating, wherein some people claim that the Queen Mary was ordered not to stop to help with rescue due to the risk of U-boats in the area, a claim primarily held by the then-captain Cyril Illingworth, while some claim that the ship did try to stop and help, namely in reports by Staff Captain Harry Gratridge. But either way, nearby British destroyers were sent in to help any potential survivors well after the ship sank. The Curacoa's captain, John Boutwood, did end up surviving and claimed to have been picked up by the destroyers, to counter Gratridge's claim. Due to hypothermia and drowning, only 99 men were rescued. After the war, in British court, it was ruled that the collision was 2/3 the fault of the Curacoa and 1/3 the Queen Mary's fault. It was assumed that the small, maneuverable cruiser would have been able to get out of the way within seconds of the collision, but since both captains assumed that the other would move, the collision occurred. This was by far the deadliest situation involving the RMS Queen Mary. There was an instance in the December of 1942 where the transport ship was 3 degrees away from capsizing after getting hit by a tidal wave, and at one point, the ship may have been in the Red Sea during a heat wave, wherein heat stroke may have occurred with a large number of people. I only saw one article about that. Apparently some records were kept classified during World War II to this day. But aside from those, there weren't too many other dramatic instances. I don't believe that anything else led to any deaths with an obituary that I could read online. Being a transport ship, the Queen Mary wasn't specifically involved in many battles, though it is important to note that she was used to transport prisoners of war from time to time, in addition to the troops. Records being as confidential as they are, it's tricky to find out who these prisoners were or what became of them, but it's World War II, so there were Nazis aboard. Also, in 1943, the Queen Mary would transport Winston Churchill to New York. Not that it's related to this section, it just felt like a historical fun fact. Bo Burnham-style segue. The military armament was removed from the Queen Mary on April 19th, 1945, though the ship would continue to transport people across the Atlantic as the European theater of the war winded down. Every article I read really likes talking about the amount of war brides that the Queen Mary transported to specifically Canada. Apparently a lot of Canadians married European people, and the Queen Mary was the go-to vessel to get them across the sea. But by September 1946, work was already underway to get the RMS Queen Mary once again refit for standard civilian transport. The Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth would be Cunard White Line's twice-a-week ship transport. Cunard would catch a dub in 1947 when the company just renamed to Cunard, and then lose said dub in 1952 when the greasy, slimy folks over at United States Line would snatch the blue ribbon with their SS United States. God bless America and its creative, thought-provoking naming schemes. Business was booming, though, and a lot of famous people, like Walt Disney, Churchill again, Elizabeth Taylor, Clark Gable, and Churchill again, took a trip on the Queen Mary. It ran aground in France in 1949, but they put it back on the ocean. However, in 1958, something even worse would happen to the Queen Mary than anything that had ever occurred to it. The sleazy, slimy scumbags behind the British Overseas Air Corporation's de Havilland DH-106 Comet commercial passenger jet, holy shit, that's what we're naming that? Made its first commercial transatlantic flight on October 4th. With this flight alone, the journey across the Atlantic went from being a 3 to 4 day venture to being able to be completed in just 8 hours. The ocean liner business was just completely destroyed at that point, and from then on, every voyage made by the RMS Queen Mary was operating at a total loss. Some voyages sailed with more crew than passengers aboard. And in the 60s, there was even a naval strike going on. Cunard had no option but to sell. Investors out in Long Beach in California ended up purchasing the vessel for $3.45 million, which is $31,995.81 when you put that number in the nifty little inflation calculator. Cool that they do the cents. That's useful to know. In September of 1967, the Queen Mary completed one last voyage across the Atlantic, going from Southampton around Cape Horn and ending up in Long Beach, where it was subsequently moored. Work then began to transform the vessel into a floating hotel, and I think you all deserve another ghost interlude. Let's just jump right in with something horrifying. I imagine it's common knowledge that massive vessels of this nature have a series of watertight doors below decks to prevent floods, in the case that the hull punctures and rooms need to be cordoned off to prevent a whole ship from flooding. These doors are really, really heavy and can crush an unwary man to death very easily. This is exactly what happened with a watertight door known as Door 13. On July 10th, 1966, I know it's history, bear with me, a fireman crew member by the name of John Petter was crushed during a routine drill when he was just 18 years old. It is thought that he risked crossing the threshold as the doors were closing automatically, and that the situation was plainly a horrible accident, but I don't believe I found any sources regarding people witnessing the event. Either way, it is a horrifying way to die and a truly tragic occurrence for someone so young. I'll talk more about this later, but Petter's inclusion in the ghost story lore is a bit controversial because he does have family members who are alive to this day who have spoken out against the ghost tours. It is important to mention Petter's sister, Pauline Howard, who has gone on record to condemn the ghost tours for using her brother's death as, quote, a peep show. I'm a young person, so the 60s feel like a long time ago to me. But John Petter was also a young person when he passed away, and his death wasn't remotely easy for his loved ones. I know I'm doing an episode on this story, and I'm just as guilty of dredging up this event to tell this story, but I am a strong believer of the notion that if you're using a ghost story as spectacle, especially if you're profiting off of it financially, and someone tells you that it's actively affecting their trauma, you should probably stop using that part of the ghost story in your ghost tour lore, even if people are witnessing the person in question as a ghost. Just have the tour guides treat the matter respectfully as if they just ask the questions but don't spit it into like a horror movie thing. I am going to talk about sightings of Petter's presence, though, and try to do it in a storytelling manner as opposed to a holy heck, look at that spectacle manner. If I'm doing that poorly, do let me know. Now, these sorts of watertight doors were removed with the ship's later conversion. The maintenance area is still open and functioning. The boat may not be moving anymore, but it is still a floating piece of machinery requiring an engine. All that being said, it is thought that the spirit prowls the area where door number 13 once stood. A spirit sporting blue jean overalls and an impressive beard. This is a description that matches Petter's appearance from old photographs, except the photographs where he doesn't have a beard that I saw. Like with Stark, many tour guides with available access to these photographs have identified the spirit of someone in the area disappearing before their eyes, though sometimes Petter is said to warn people to leave the area. He is also reported to pantomime engineering work as a translucent spirit. To get into specifics, one story goes that a security guard was roaming the premises during the conversion of the Queen Mary from ship to hotel. Obviously, no one had any reason to be there after hours, but the security guard's German shepherd was under the impression that an intruder was nonetheless present. He went wild, barking like mad, to a degree of volume much higher than he was trained for. But the strange thing was that he only started going mad when the dog and his handler went down to the area where door number 13 stood. The guard, who I should mention at this point is remaining anonymous, then reported hearing an enormous sound from out of nowhere, the sound of a heavy metal door slowly slamming shut. A noise that may have come from a watertight door closing, if that were still a feature on the ship. The man and his dog ran out of there, both safe, but still intensely frightened. It is widely accepted that the ghosts of J. Petter and W.E. Stark are the most frequently spotted ghosts, at least the most frequently cited in regards to spirits that people are pretty sure they can connect with someone who verifiably passed away on the premises. There are a couple of other spirits on deck with more colorful names. That is a pun. One of them is a lady in white. But unlike the two aforementioned ghosts, it's trickier to connect them to a particular person who passed away on the Queen Mary, which brings me to a small tangent. Some sources will claim that a serial killer was killing while aboard the Queen Mary in the 60s. Some claim that a father murdered his daughter, or a husband murdered his wife. But unless there has been an enormous cover-up by the establishment that regularly hosts ghost tours and leans into the haunting, there have never been any murders aboard the HMS Queen Mary. Aside from a few man-overboard situations, the situation with the Curacoa, Stark and Petter's accidental deaths, and a skull fracture in 1936, everyone else who passed away while traveling the high seas on the Queen Mary did so of natural causes, or their deaths were kept private. Though double devil's advocate moment, no article ever wants to tell me about that skull fracture. I really only found that on a list of deceased passengers, and the only thing I know about it is that it was a sailor by the name of A.J. Golding, and it was a guy who had a skull fracture in 1936. That one just never features into the lore that often, and I don't think he's associated with any hauntings. There are also legends of a ghost named John Henry, who allegedly died while on deck in the years before World War II. He's even also sometimes credited as also having been crushed by door number 13, but according to the records and obituaries, he too never existed. Now, it's time to jump into the third and final history arc, the Queen Mary's stint as a hotel. On April 6, 1968, the Queen Mary was kept in dry dock at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard until it was moved to Pier J on February 27th in 1971. It wasn't the largest sea voyage of all time, having looked it up that distance on Google Maps, but they did have to move the Queen Mary more than 500 meters, once again continuing the tradition of failing to renovate your massive 80,000-ton vessel at the location you plan on using it. Now earlier, I mentioned that you need to keep an engine room even if the ship isn't sailing, but what I didn't mention is the fact that they removed a large portion of the mechanical ship such and such in the ship's renovation process. Namely, all of the boiler rooms and the front engine room. Other renovations included the addition of a Jacques Cousteau seafaring museum, a fancy restaurant, a western bar, a wedding chapel, a small shopping center, a food court, and a pool area that people could look at but not use due to the fact that the safety codes evolved over time, even though they taunted guests by filling up the pool with water until the 1980s. An observation deck/bar did keep an Art Deco theme, so that's cool. In February, in 1972, the hotel part of the hotel opened up. I didn't find anywhere online how much this all costed, but this section's a tad bit long as is. I just wanted to mention that I tried. In 1980, Jack Rather of Ratherport Properties Ltd. And the further Rather Corporation bought a lease for the entire ship, which up until that point had been run in a really weird way where each independent business owned and operated on a lease separately, even though they were all in the same boat. Boat, ship, what have you. I go back and forth on those. I'm not a naval person. Rather also flexed by shipping in Howard Hughes' H-4 Hercules Spruce Goose flying boat as an additional exhibit. Now, fans of Disney lore will also recognize Jack Rather for another large flex of his. The fact that he and his company owned the Disneyland Hotel since its conception, due to the fact that Walt Disney himself ran out of money and couldn't really do it alone. Because of the massive success of the hotel, the Disney Corporation had been trying for years and years and years to buy it from Rather. However, On November 12, 1984, the investor would pass away, and the Disney Corporation would finally be able to purchase the entire Ratha Corporation in March 1988. As a result of this, the Queen Mary was officially a Disney property starting that year. It was a $152 million investment. They really, really wanted that hotel. I'm not defunct land, however, so I won't dwell on Eisner-era Disney lore for long, except to point out the fact that Disney almost turned the entire Long Beach port area surrounding the Queen Mary into an entire theme park destination called Port Disney. This idea was scrapped when the much cheaper Disney's California Adventure popped off of the Imagineers drawing boards in 1992, prompting Disney to give up their lease and returning the Queen Mary to the city of Long Beach to operate. Fun fact, the Port Disney idea would be further conceptualized into Disney Sea before the idea was abandoned. But despite that, the Disney Sea concept would be built across the sea in Tokyo Disney. They did not move the Queen Mary over for that. The Queen Mary closed towards the end of 1992, until a new lease was bought by the RMS Foundation and Joseph F. Pravratil for a 5-year lease. Business was booming for a while. The RMS Foundation extended its lease, though management of the Queen Mary would be taken over by a slew of management companies throughout the years. The hotel/museum was well received, and starting as early as the 90s, the Queen Mary's haunted reputation began to circulate throughout the media. Ghost tours were even started, and during the Halloween season of 2009, Dark Harbor debuted, a haunted house/carnival that leaned in heavily into the harbor's haunted history. I should add, it was an actual themed haunted house attraction. The quote-unquote real ghost tours would be more of a perennial fixture that focused on the ship's history as well. The special effects were used in some sections of the tour. A new company bought the lease in 2016, the Urban Commons Real Estate Group. A name that gives me cyberpunk energy. I don't like it. However, despite the fact that we draw ever nearer to the present, the Queen Mary still had a few more obstacles to overcome. In 2017, a report was issued by surveyors that concluded that the hull was corroding, as were support structures, and that it was only a matter of time until severe flooding damage occurred. Apparently, Urban Commons didn't put the necessary investment money into making the boat float well. The repair bill came out to $300 million, to which the city of Long Beach responded with, "What can you do with $23 million? Despite the fact that the basic rules of mathematics were being ignored, Urban Commons took the money and did what they could with it. In 2019, though, it was discovered that the damages were actually worse, and that Urban Commons were not really doing anything to fix the ship outside of what the $23 million could buy. Long Beach threatened to go back on the lease, and Urban Commons responded with, "Oh, yo, give me more time. We'll do better with repairs. I mean, after all, it's 2019. I feel like the next few years will be really good for the tourist industry." The next few years were not really good for the tourist industry. COVID-19 happened and is still happening at the time of this episode. 3 cheers for endemic pandemics. The ship was closed for a few years due to the pandemic, and the management group had no choice but to file for bankruptcy on the Queen Mary in 2021. Long Beach took back control over the vessel, and even though it really, really looked like the Queen Mary wouldn't survive, on December 15th, 2022, literally 1 month and 2 days ago from the time that I'm writing this, the Queen Mary reopened to the public under management of a company known as Evolution Hospitality. The hotel portion isn't open, but they are holding tours. And yeah, we've caught up to the modern day, finally. But oh my gosh, keep an eye out for the Queen Mary, everyone, because it might not be around forever. They haven't fixed all the damage yet. Obviously, there are way more important things in the world to donate your money to. I don't think I'd ever advocate for something like, "Hey guys, support the Queen Mary Kickstarter. It's really important." I also really don't think they have a Kickstarter. But yeah, the Queen Mary is just not doing great at the time of this episode. Before the ship goes to a watery grave, however, let's talk about the hauntings. Fun fact, in an issue published in 2008, Time magazine stated that the Queen Mary was the 5th most haunted place of all time. We talked about the tragic accidents of W.E. Stark and J. Petter, and the fact that their spirits are said to linger. But who all else is on deck? It's time to talk about Jackie. According to sources, the ghost of a little girl has been seen haunting the Queen Mary, primarily around the swimming pools. The urban legend crowd believes that this is the spirit of a 5 or 6-year-old girl by the name of Jacqueline Torrin, who tragically died from drowning in the pool. But much like the murder stories, this origin is not backed up by any obituary or manifest. From what sources can tell me, the name Jackie came to a psychic by the name of Peter James in 1991, which did lead me down a small little rabbit hole. Though I may be a bit of a believer, I am very dubious about psychic mediums, and scoped out Peter James's online presence to see if what other claims he may have made, only to realize that he was the producer of the show Ghost Encounters, the Queen Mary, a show that came out in 2007, which also happens to be the year that Peter James passed away. He definitely kept mostly to ghost hunting and writing horror fiction, from what I could tell, so I respect him in as much as he steered away from the Sylvia Browne career path. IMDb is the source there. Tangent over. In regards to Peter James's first encounter with Jackie, he and a ghost hunting crew were in a room that used to house the ship's second swimming pool before being renovated. The little girl came into the room and said, "Meet me at the other pool," before disappearing. There was a pool that was still on display, but it didn't even occur to the team that they were in the presence of the place that used to house the second. James and the film crew followed her instructions, went to the area of the first pool, and recorded an entire 10-minute actual conversation between Peter James and the disembodied voice of a little girl. It's actually a video that I was able to find, and you can hear the girl's voice and everything. If I knew copyright law better, I might even consider adding a clip of it to this episode. But I don't. She's not very easy to understand, but me, Forsetti Fox, definitely heard phrases like, "Help me," and "I'm caught," and "Want to look?" Getting shouted, but in a sort of, "Help me!" way where she's being exasperated about something instead of scared. Peter James's approach to the voice is to comfort her, and let her know things like, "You don't have to stay here," and "Your family loves you." Which I kinda dig. He wants to help her pass. But yeah, I don't cover nearly enough stories where I get to actually see and hear footage like that. It's wild. Peter James looks like Mark Twain also. No exorcisms occurred in 1991, according to the legend, and sightings of the little girl continue to this day, including another piece of evidence that I can actually find online. A photograph of a little girl peering over the side of a solid railing, going down the stairs of the pool area. It's definitely a little girl's face, not even blurry, placing a hand up on the railing, and the photo was taken at night, in a room where it's highly unlikely a girl's just hanging out after hours, during a ghost investigation. I couldn't find the year that the photograph was taken, but I did find the name of the photographer if you want to look it up later, Priscilla Uriarte. This is sourced from Bob Davis and Brian Clune from their book on the subject, but further research into the depths of YouTube helped me discover that the two authors also recorded a conversation with Jackie themselves, that I was also able to hear with my own ears. In an investigation in 2008, Jackie was recorded shouting, "Candy!" while Davis was fidgeting in his pocket with a piece of hard candy, something nobody else saw. She also shouts something like, "You're not my uncle," which gets picked up on the audio, but the two investigators can't make it out at the time, which is weird, and or confirmation bias, because Davis would later ask Jackie to refer to him as Uncle Bob, and this EVP was recorded beforehand. The voice is quite similar to the 1991 recording, but again, I'm sipping the confirmation bias juice. Jackie is often seen dashing around the ship's quarters, especially after dark, and is often accompanied by the sound of wet feet running on linoleum. She's known to call out to her mother, though she will also interact with living people, usually in a friendly way, saying hello or playing peekaboo. To tie this little thread up with a bow, it is speculated that this is the ghost of a civilian girl who was transported across the Atlantic immediately after World War II, the child of a war bride. This is still a point in time where the going-ons aboard the Queen Mary were still confidential, so, makes you think. There are also reports of a woman dressed in a white evening gown appearing as an apparition. While she is often called the Lady in White, some have given her the name Sarah, though I could not find any psychic who gave her that name, or if it's just a fun little organic development in the urban legend. The aforementioned website with the records of obituaries doesn't always give away people's first names, so maybe a person named Sarah actually passed away while aboard the Queen Mary. But either way, she's often sighted around the observation deck bar, and doesn't typically bring about any ghostly activity besides the feeling of a cold spot or the often cited notion that one is being watched. Though sometimes, she is known to dance to vintage music manifesting out of nowhere. Some claim that Sarah is Jackie's ghostly guardian, but the legend gets far more muddled than that, because some claim that Sarah is the name given to another ghost entirely. Another spirit of a little girl, this time an 8-year-old as opposed to Jackie's younger 5 or 6-year-old description, who also kind of acts as a big sister guardian. The Lady in White could be someone else entirely, but this part of the story doesn't get the same notoriety as Jackie herself, so the lore is a bit harder to parse. Before I move on, though, I figured I'd bring up reports from the Unsolved Mysteries website and quote a server at the bar known as Carol Layden, who talks about her encounter with the Lady in White. This episode has admittedly been light on quotes. I've been here for about 14 years when I first had the first experience of actually seeing what I thought to be a ghost. I was in the work area, and for some reason I picked up a cup of coffee, went out to the tables, and there was a lady sitting there. I was so fascinated by her dress. She appeared to be in a late afternoon cocktail type dress from the 40s. She had dark hair, rolled at the sides, no makeup on. She seemed to be very pale, but I never saw her move. I left the table, went up about 10 feet, turned around because I wanted to take another look, and there was nothing there. The next paranormal hotspot is associated with a room itself, as opposed to a person in specific. Stateroom B340 is a suite that consists of what used to be 3 different third-class staterooms. On the Queen Mary's website, it's listed as the most haunted room you can book. So, devil's advocate, this is a story people are using for financial gain. They actually advertise the room as having a Ouija board and crystal ball available in the room for guests to use. They even hold seances sometimes. But that's not to say that weird things have been going on in that space since literally the 60s, when the Queen Mary was still sailing. In fact, the people staying in the room during the final voyage of the ship reported hearing knocking on their door all throughout the night, only to find the hallway empty. The sink faucets were said to turn on randomly, lights flickered on and off, and doors slammed on their own. While visages of apparitions are a tad bit lacking in room B340, the poltergeist activity never stops. In the article by Julie Tremaine on the Sci-Fi website, I knew I sourced her. Look at me. She actually goes into detail about her stay in stateroom B340. She even invited renowned paranormal investigators Greg and Dana Newkirk. Parentheses, everyone watched the series titled Hellier, thank you. Other paranormal investigators of renown, Amy Bruni, and John E.L. Tinney, were also present. But I don't really know them as much. I think you should probably look them up, I just don't know them. However, the devil's advocate here is gunning to give even Jimmy McGill a run for his lawyering money in regards to this room, because in this article it is claimed that Disney, in an attempt to evoke Haunted Mansion vibes, put in features for this room to recreate a haunting, such as placing the floorboards in an intentionally creaky way, and even wiring the faucet to turn on by itself. But this is the only article that I found that piece of information on, and it's thought that most of the more active features have been since removed. Not to mention the fact that even before Disney had possession of the property, ghosts were sighted in this room. Devil's advocate moment over. The Newkirks brought out the Estes method for this room. Always love to hear it. For the uninitiated, the Estes method is a ghost communication technique where you have someone listen to a spirit box, a device that rapidly scours through radio waves to pick up various frequencies at a breakneck pace, with the hopes of hopefully catching various words, in which spirits are said to communicate through. But instead of just listening, you use sensory deprivation on the person listening to the spirit box and ask the room questions, to which the person with the soundproof headphones speaks out loud any words they hear. This is supposed to prevent confirmation bias, and works weirdly really well. Apparently, the alleged contacted spirit admitted that speaking through the spirit box was too much of a hassle and refused to give up its name, though it did admit to the party that it was very annoyed at their presence. Even though it sounds like they were respectful, that's just my confirmation bias. Admittedly, the Newkirks had an entire haunted traveling museum full of alleged cursed objects, and they brought a couple on deck in order to maybe provoke any haunted energies. That could have potentially been annoying to resident spirits. Eventually, the spirit refused to talk altogether, but that was far from the ghost hunting party's only stint with the paranormal. Tremaine would hear voices outside of the room at 3 a.m, only to find the hallway empty when she checked it. While admitting that it is possible that people could run down the hallway, the room is notorious and oftentimes draws a wayward ghost hunting audience. Tremaine would also report picking up strange pictures on her structured light sensor camera. The picture of a shadowy stick figure looming over her bed. And she'd also pick up the word hassle on her own EVP recorder, clear and angry. It is important to note that she couldn't sleep the entire night out of fear, and would have remembered someone else in the room looming over her. Hey everybody, Foxxo Esoterica interruption. The door's shut right now. But for 1 second I thought Puma came home and opened the door because I definitely heard a door sound. Nobody's home, it's just me. So that's cool. I feel like, it's not the most interesting thing ever, but since I'm recording a ghost story podcast, I feel like I gotta bring it up. I went back through the audio and I couldn't hear it, but I also have a whole blanket covering the microphone to prevent such things, so... Ghosts. We'll see if I die before I finish recording. The bow is the front of the ship. The stern is the back. Keep listening for more naval knowledge. I may even talk about which side's the starboard side. Potentially unfunny bits aside, paranormal activity is often reported at the very end of the Queen Mary's bow. Namely, some people report hearing a frightening chorus of screams while standing at the ship's front edge. And more often than not, this story is associated with the 239 poor, lost souls of the doomed HMS Curacoa. To further illustrate this, I have another quote from the Unsolved Mysteries case file, from a marine engineer by the name of John Smith in 1967, as soon as the Queen Mary arrived in Long Beach. While working on the hotel conversion over a few months, Smith reports that he, quote, could hear the sound of metal tearing, water rushing, and then men screaming. It sounded like there had been a rupture of the ship's hull. It was frightful. I went up to the extreme bow section of the ship. The sound was there, but there was no water and nothing to cause it. I don't believe in supernatural things, but in all my experience as a marine engineer, I'd never seen anything like this. Moving on, though, I mentioned earlier that some psychics claim that there are over 150 spirits aboard the Queen Mary. That number felt weird. It's far removed from the 49 confirmed onboard deaths, as well as the 239 victims of the sinking of the Curacoa. But nevertheless, I think I read that Peter James claimed that over 600 spirits were present, according to Davis and Clune's book, so I don't know who came up with that 150 number. I know 600 is a bit big of a number personally. I do believe that there are more than a few dozen spirits on board. And what really cements this notion for me is the fact that even though there are so many different ghost reports that adhere to the established lore, be that of ghosts like J. Petter or W.E. Stark, who have confirmed deaths, or Jackie and the Lady in White, who aren't confirmed, but nevertheless have a rich urban legend lore, some ghostly reports just exist without any precedent or established lore, and in this section, I'd like to bring up a couple that have interested me. In a YouTube video on the channel Part-Time Explorer, a man named Bill Sauter is interviewed. Did I just say interview like that? Interviewed. Sauter worked as a tour guide in the 70s, a time where the Queen Mary's supernatural going-ons were locally known, but not an international phenomenon yet. He even claims that during the 70s, the tour guides were instructed to keep the ghost sightings hush-hush. It was thought that it was bad for business. His first encounter happens in 1979 at 11 in the morning, in the swimming pool. But instead of witnessing Jackie, Sauter claims to have seen a woman in her 20s, dressed in an orange Velma from Scooby-Doo style turtleneck, but also a vest, large tortoiseshell sunglasses, and other 60s Woodstock-esque fashion choices. Sauter approached the woman and asked if she was lost and needed help, but as soon as he passed a pillar, the woman disappeared completely, a vanishing act that would require actual teleportation if she wanted to get out of the spot in the pool area without being seen. The distance to the door was 50 feet away. She didn't even make a sound, despite the fact that the loose tile she stood on often made a clattering noise should one step on those steps. Despite not believing in ghosts before, Sauter believed he saw an apparition, though he did scour the room for any sign of the woman. He found no signs that anyone was present. Sauter's next paranormal occurrence occurred a week later, again at the pool, during the morning. Because the management wanted to install floodlights to help light the room up, they had to drill through the vintage tile. And it was on this morning that Sauter was alarmed that part of the tile could be damaged, so he hopped a partition and went to investigate. He peered up towards the ceiling, leaning out over the pool, but just then, something pushed Sauter hard. He would have fallen right into the water, if the same invisible force didn't immediately pull him back. There were red marks on his shoulder for the rest of the day. It was also on this video where Bill Sauter and another man by the name of Dave Pitcock talked about John Petter's accident, and though both did end up seeing his body, they weren't there for the accident itself, and it's strange, because the doors have a grace period of about 30 seconds before they close, and they can be held open if someone needs to pass. So, it's speculated that Petter was trying to keep the doors open himself. It's quoted that he was almost playing chicken with them, but he tragically passed away alone, and it's not something that anyone really has the answers to. This is a bit of a tangent, but it was interesting to hear further insights on that case. There are a lot of other hauntings, so I'm going to rapid-fire go through a list of paranormal ephemera that I haven't mentioned yet. There's a ghost named Grumpy, who is often reported as a shadowy figure that growls at people and smells like cigarettes. There are also a lot of reports of a dapper-dressed gentleman in vintage 30s clothing, hanging out at the Veranda Grill, before disappearing. The Veranda Grill is the aforementioned fancy restaurant. I think they named it after the actual Veranda Grill that was a feature of the actual Queen Mary when it was sailing. Tunes composed by Glenn Miller, the famous swing musician, manifest out of nowhere. Security cameras routinely snap pictures of a shadowy figure looming in the hallway. Some of them actually look like the shapes of people instead of blurry photograph chicanery. And all manner of footsteps, pushing, scratching, electrical tomfoolery, and everything else associated with ghosts persist on every square inch of the vessel. Which brings me to the next point I want to make. I know I talked about 150 spirits like 4 paragraphs ago, but perhaps this number can be attributed to the paranormal investigator and anomalist, that's his word and not mine, but I do like it a lot, Christopher Chakan, who also did investigations on the Queen Mary during the 90s. Chakan and his team put in 18 months of investigations aboard the HMS Queen Mary, did I say HMS? RMS Queen Mary, and conducted over 1,500 interviews with passengers. During this stint, he'd catalog every little instance of things going bump in the night and added these accounts to the ones reported by hotel goers and compiled over 12,000 cases of potential paranormal activity. 30% of these cases could not be considered to have mundane causes, in Chakan's words. He also moved on to a lot of different paranormal projects and really only wrote about the process of his investigation of the Queen Mary without adding any anecdotes. So alas, this section is anecdoteless. As a consolation, allow me to share a story off of Reddit by user LoveCats29. That's cats with a K. Whether or not you believe it, you must admit that it is a well-written story that will help me segue out of this anecdoteless pit that I've dug for myself. It was the early 1990s, and Disney had recently purchased the Queen Mary and started conducting ghost tours of the ship. At the time, my father was the manager of the hotel portion of the attraction and was a complete skeptic. That didn't stop him from telling us stories at the dinner table about how maids would regularly quit after having encounters, or cleaning a room and ducking out to get fresh towels and coming back to find the room completely trashed. He found it amusing, at least until the afternoon that my sister, my college roommate, and I decided to take the ghost tour. He set us up with a tour group with several other tourists, and we followed the guide around as he told us about history of the vessel, as well as stories about strange things that had taken place on the ship. There were no special effects or people in costumes. It just wasn't that kind of tour. I remember in the first-class poker room, he had told a story about a reappearing bloodstain on the floor that was still visible. They would clean it, change the carpet, etc., and the stain would always return. That creeped me out big time, but the scariest was yet to come. He took us down to the first-class swimming pool, where a little girl's spirit is often seen. We were standing on the stairs at one end of the pool, with the dressing rooms on the far end. I noticed that my sister and my roommate were whispering loudly to each other. They turned to me to ask if I had seen the man at the other end of the pool. I had not. They both described him as an older gentleman with a white beard and navy-colored clothing standing near one of the tiled columns. I looked, but didn't see anyone. They both said that he had just disappeared. My sister was very upset and asked the tour guide who the man was and where he had gone. The tour guide assured her that there was no one in this area of the ship, that it was restricted. We walked down the stairs to the right-hand side of the pool, down the side and through the dressing rooms in the back, and exited on the other side where they had seen the man. There was no way for him to get out of the area without him passing by us. After the tour, we went directly to my father's office. My sister was extremely anxious and freaked out. She told my father the story, and he told her that it was probably a maintenance man, and that he would make some calls and find out. Never mind the fact that now that Disney owns the property, employees were not allowed to have facial hair. Later that night, my father came home from work, and my sister confronted him straight away about whether he found out if there was a maintenance man in the pool area. He had told her that yes, there had been a man in the area, and she calmed down. Fast forward a few years later, and we were talking about other creepy encounters when my sister starts to joke about the ghost she saw on the Queen Mary. We all start to laugh, and my father sheepishly states that he had just told her that there was a maintenance man to calm her down. Any maintenance would have been scheduled after the tours were done for the day. He had contacted security to make sure no one else had snuck down there, and they didn't find a soul. So this sampler platter of ghost stories only scratches the surface of the whole ghostly narrative, but I'm mixing idioms, and such literary blunders are a good indicator that my mind just spent, and it's time to tackle the conclusions. Fuck, where do we start? Peek behind the curtain, I'm choosing to write this section at 4 in the morning, which will get really fun writing when I try to record later. Oh my gosh, let's see if it works. But I just spent 80 paragraphs on ghost stories. I imagine the skeptical crowd dipped out when the history section ended, and I'm going to dive right into ghost lore. So, for starters, I believe there are ghosts here. This is a haunting, I believe. But let's jump into why and how it's working. 1. I evoke the hotel phenomenon. Hotels and areas of high human traffic, like hospitals, theaters, cruise ships, have a tendency for drawing spirits more often, and the Queen Mary, having been an ocean liner, wartime troopship, and hotel, definitely fits this bill. I feel like I talk about this concept a lot on the podcast, but who am I to assume that this isn't some audience member's first episode? So I'll explain. Either because a large amount of people coming and going through a place naturally leads to more on-property deaths, or because people carry a lot of spiritual energy and drop it off piecemeal, a bit in areas with a lot of people. Or perhaps something else entirely. It is commonly believed that these sorts of spaces draw hauntings more often than private homes. And considering seafaring vessels automatically keep a log of all onboard deaths and births, we know that the Queen Mary has had its fair share of tragedies. So yes, I evoke the hotel phenomena in this haunting. 2. I evoke the stone tape theory. In paranormal communities, it is thought that particularly dramatic events where emotions are high, usually a death, have a way of metaphorically getting recorded to tape, playing out the particularly dramatic scene for a centuries-long amount of time, give or take. While these sorts of hauntings aren't associated with actual sentient spirits who stick around, refusing to move on to the afterlife, people still report hearing the sound of people screaming or see ghosts pantomime their death, and they report the recorded tape of said dramatic event. In addition, supernatural ephemera such as cold spots, electrical chicanery, missing time, etc., also get reported in these stone tape theory hauntings. Kinda like the furry visual novel Echo, which is slowly becoming another spot on the Foxxo Esoterica bingo card. I love Echo. The supernatural stuff associated with the HMS Kurakoa definitely fits this description, and I can be convinced that this is the case with J-Patter, though probably not any other hauntings. So yeah, I evoke stone tape theory. 3. What the fuck is up with Jackie? Who's Jackie? Who's Lady in White? Who's Grumpy? I'll tell you what, I'm grumpy. Grumpy that this particular puzzle lacks tangible pieces. So, another haunting phenomenon is that ghosts will be witnessed of people who didn't actually die on the property, which seems to be the case for the ghosts of the little girl, because as far as I can find, no drownings occurred in the pool, and no little girls died on deck. Like I mentioned earlier, this could pertain to events during World War II that were kept confidential, or perhaps somebody passed away as an older woman and somehow manifested as a little girl in her spiritual form. But this is just speculation. The names of Jacqueline Torrin, John Henry, and Sarah, parentheses maybe, are made up of whole cloth, either by psychic mediums who are having some fun, or urban legends that are getting lore established without consulting the ship's manifest first. Though a little girl's voice has canonically been recorded, and I heard it, I don't think she ever said, bada bing bada boom, the name's Jacqueline, I'll be happy to haunt you this evening. Unless it was muddled and I somehow missed it. Which brings me to, I evoke tulpa theory. Which maybe isn't one that like the whole paranormal community talks about that often, because it's kind of like easy to be like, the tulpa, we've formed a thought form in reality. But in my words, some hauntings can manifest in the ways that an observer associates them with, even if the legend's lore isn't backed up with historical evidence. So in this instance, even though Jackie doesn't exist in records, some people, who maybe don't know that, take a trip to the swimming pool and expect to see the ghost of a little girl. And maybe the haunting takes that expectation and manifests accordingly. Which is creepy, because that means ghosts can read your mind, and sometimes want to manipulate you, if that's true. So yay. Anyway, there are some normal ghosts. 4. Normal ghost theory. The theory that some ghosts are normal. With things like poltergeist activity and spirits manifesting in era-appropriate garb, I tend to interpret them as the hauntings of actual spirits of people who, for some reason or another, haven't felt compelled to move on to the afterlife. I don't think that we have any guilty murderers on board or people who have a horrifying dark secret that they don't want God to find out. But honestly, I think the experience of dying is probably really traumatic if the human soul exists. And some souls probably either take that trauma really poorly and kind of have a denial about being dead thing going on, or are just really afraid of the afterlife enough to not even want to pass as a sane and sober soul. I think that when it comes to ghosts, it takes a really long time for the traumatized soul to process that they're dead, and I don't think time passes in the same way. Or if it does, the ghosts don't interpret the time passing the same way as living people do. And I think that in other cases, some people just want to hang out for a bit. Some of the Queen Mary's ghosts really like chatting with people at the bar, and I imagine that sort of thing can stay interesting enough for centuries. So yeah, I evoke normal ghost vibes, which actually in this case amounts to 2 different things. traumatized ghosts, and ghosts that are just hanging out. Do not ask me about that Woodstock Velma ghost because I have no idea where that came from, and it was one of the most sober-sounding ghost stories I've ever heard a person tell. Kudos to Bill Sauter. Woodstock Velma doesn't even fit anywhere in the story to me, especially considering no legend, is kind of, written about her or anything, with Jackie. That was just cited and was never cited again as far as I can tell. So, in my humble opinion, I can see there being maybe 1 or maybe 2 dozen ghosts aboard the Queen Mary. I think that the victims of the collision of the HMS Curacoa aren't sticking around in the afterlife, so I will not be adding their number to the tally. Stone tape theory, it counts as 1. I really hope that tragedy is far enough in the past for this paragraph to not come across as morbid. I think there are a handful of spirits that are just sort of hanging out, and I think that on top of that there's a dark manipulative spirit on board that's unattached to any spirit, and I don't know where it came from. No one's ever suffered harm from the spirit as far as I can tell, so maybe it's just a curious thing, but Tulpa Theory ghosts, in my opinion, as an amateur paranormal investigator, don't have the same psychology as the ghosts of people, so who knows what they want to do. But yes, the ship is haunted, in my opinion. I believe that the management is being a little silly for leaning into the ghost stuff as much as they are, especially in regards to John Petter, but I don't think they're completely making up the haunting just to make money. I think they're definitely taking the story and embellishing it and squeezing out as much money as possible from it, but there are far less moral ways of making money, and ghost stories are fun. They don't have to be drenched in historical accuracy in order to be a vibe. If only Urban Commons would have spent said money to stop the Queen Mary from actively corroding. There's a hot take somewhere about the psychic mediums coming in, but it looks like that got the sci-fi and ghost hunting crowd and not the cold reading show psychic crowd, and they got results, so I dig it. They're getting tricked though, there's no Jackie. Having never been to Long Beach and never taken a tour, I think the tour guides have done a really good job of sharing the Queen Mary's rich tapestry of the history throughout the years. And even aside from the ghost stuff, the vessel has such a fascinating story that I'm glad I researched as much of it as I did. And that the Queen Mary had such a motivated team of people behind it sharing said story. And I think it's really cool that the ship's reputation for being haunted started a neat local Halloween tradition with Dark Harbor, and even almost suckered in 90s era Michael Eisner into almost making a cool financial decision for once. This story is famous for so many reasons, and each of those reasons were very, very fun to read about. Also, haunted. So haunted. Easily one of the most haunted. I think if you don't believe in ghosts and someone puts a gun to your head and says, pick one haunting to believe, do it. This one is a safe bet. That hypothetical situation was brought to you by 5 in the Morning Forseti Fox. Cue the outro theme.
Ah, sleep. I think I got 5 hours before writing this. There's a degree to which I should probably not drink 5 cups of coffee a day. Before I bid you a bon voyage, though, let's hop on over to the review corner. Today's reviews will be quite easy to find. The Queen Mary is, indeed, a hotel. SS Boissite Vuong writes, my wife and I stayed at the Queen Mary for our honeymoon in 2017, and it was the best hotel stay we've had yet. They upgraded our rooms for free, delivered us champagne and chocolate strawberries as a wedding present, and gave us a free ghost tour on our last day. The ship itself was a fun little museum experience, and getting to have coffee on deck is something you don't want to miss. I'm sad to hear all about the recent issues the ship has had. I really recommend seeing it while you still can. 5 stars. Ashlyn Bradford writes, it was a delightful ride out on the ocean by a full moon watching for meteors. We saw a couple and everybody there was so relaxing. 5 stars. I think I keep bashing Urban Commons for not upkeeping the ship well, but at least they run a good hotel, it seems. HW writes, Shacktoberfest was amazing. O/O do not recommend VIP. It was a waste of money. Long lines prevented us from seeing certain things, but we had a blast. DJ Lovecraft and Skeleton Sam were amazing. Great set. 5 stars. What the hell is Shacktoberfest? Googling it now. Okay, looks like they renamed Dark Harbor, and now the Halloween festival is named after Shaq of basketball fame. Shaq. Ghost believer confirmed. XPLR fan writes, it was fun, but it was kinda weird because I keep hearing voices and seeing doors open and seeing ghosts, but I went there because I saw it had a good rating, but why I gave it 4 stars is that it was a nice place to stay, and it was pretty cool. 4 stars. Wow, ghost haters are out there. Sad state of affairs. But that'll wrap up today's review corner, I do believe. You can find Foxxo Esoterica on Anchor, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, Spotify, and YouTube. You can follow Foxxo Esoterica on Twitter at FORSETIFOX and on TikTok at FORSYFOX. And you can support Foxxo Esoterica on Patreon and Coffee at FORSETIFOX for both. Thanks to Sun El Chiquito for the podcast artwork. May fair winds bless your sails. And see, you know what? I told you that it would take a while for medical people to get here. Those are for me. My hypothermia is